There we go. So this is page 6 in your course notes from the last package, from the respiratory system package. The reading is on page 443 in your textbook. So it talks about different ways to measure the capacity of your lungs. So you can discuss things like total lung capacity. Total lung capacity would be like if you took somebody's lungs out and like filled them up with water all the way to the top, the absolute full volume from bottom to top. But it's not the most functional measurement because you can't really ventilate 100% of your lungs. There's a spot that's the dead spot, which is your bronchioles and your bronchi, and your trachea, because that part is not functional, right? There's no gas exchange happening there. So then you can remove that volume. There's ways to do that. You can talk about how much you regularly breathe in, the volume of air that you're breathing right now at rest. That's your tidal volume. And then there's like a number of different ways to measure the functional volumes of your lungs. So like I said, there's a little reading there on page 443, and it talks about those different volumes. It uses this diagram to explain them below. There's some short forms on there. Once you do the reading, I think this makes a lot more sense. Okay, so you're gonna start with that. It's on page 443. You're gonna read section 10.3 in your textbook. So that chapter is about a number of different things. Here, I'll pull the text up here. I'll give you a topic summary. It's all respiratory system stuff. Okay, so it talks a little bit about air pressure and how air pressure affects the gas exchange across the membrane. Why, when you, like, for example, climb a mountain, it's more difficult for you to breathe. So it talks a little bit about altitude. It talks a little bit about how carbon dioxide goes back and forth across the membrane. And lastly, it talks a little bit about the neural control of breathing. So how you actually like mentally control your lungs and then your autonomic nervous system, how your lungs are being controlled right now when you're at rest, because you're not functionally thinking, okay, breathe in, breathe out. It's all a product of your autonomic nervous system. So part of your brainstem is controlling that. Okay, so that's what the chapter is about. Here you can add any new vocabulary to your vocabulary list, and then there are some questions that you complete at the end. I have a little exit quiz here. Again, these exit quizzes are never for marks, but they're just like a little indicator to you. Have a little look through there, and then just make sure that you're familiar with all the material that you come across. And then the second part of this, when you're done that, is there's a little video here, very similar to the one that you watched on the digestive system. It's a little bit on the old side. I think it's from the 1980s. But believe it or not, the respiratory system hasn't actually, or the circulatory system hasn't changed that much since the 1980s. It's exactly the same circulatory system. And there's a lot of really cool video components here that are difficult to find. They have a lot of awesome microscopy work where they take a microscope video of actual blood vessels with blood flowing through them. So you can see the red blood cells being stacked up and going through capillaries and things like that. It's really cool. I can't find a video clip of this anywhere else of that process. So this is like the best video I can find of this, and it really is kind of cool. Anyway, so there's a video and there's a little question sheet that goes along with it. It's about 20 minutes long. Okay, so that's block 1. You guys can work on that at your leisure there. For learning block 2, there is a notes package for today for the beginning of the circulatory system. So it's posted underneath today's content right here. So it's unit 3, part 3, circulatory system. It's also linked here. I said, or did I link it there? Maybe I didn't. Maybe I didn't. Anyway, but it's there. It's under day 13. It's right there. So you'll need to make a copy of that. We're going to do a little lesson together. We're going to talk about the main types of blood vessels. We're going to talk about the heart, the parts of the heart, that kind of stuff. And then there's some questions for you to finish at the end. Okay. This note's a little bit longer. It's probably going to take all learning block 2. Tomorrow is the last day of this unit. Can you believe it? These units just fly right by. In the morning, we're going to finish this package. So I'm just going to scroll down real quick so you can see where we're headed. Oh, by the way, the video sheet that goes along with that circulatory system video, it's the first page or 2 pages of the notes package. So it's right up here at the top, just so you know. That goes along with that circulatory system video. So tomorrow we're going to talk about the cardiac cycle. So we're going to discuss how your brain controls your heart rate, and a little bit about how EKGs work, or ECGs, depending on which country you're in. And we're going to talk about some circulatory system disorders, just like we talked about some respiratory system disorders. So some potential ways that the system can go wrong. That's in the morning tomorrow. Hopefully, this won't take more than an hour, because then I was planning on doing the fetal pig dissection tomorrow. So that's not a drill. So we're going to go out this way, down to the bottom, okay? All the way to the bottom parking lot, guys. That's great.
West basement, shops, and gym. West basement, shops, and gym. Attention staff and students, we are going to have to evacuate the building. Please evacuate the building according to procedure. Ignore all wayfare signs. Thank you.
come in. Do a little do-over here. Hey guys, sorry about the delay there. There's a half hour lost in the morning. Whoops. Hey, are people still there? If everyone left, it wouldn't be surprising. 20 viewers. Oh, people are still there. Cool. 20. That's a little bit weird. Is there 20 people at home? No, that doesn't make sense.
Gone.
We just got some extras. Well, that is a little bit weird. I'm also teaching a biology class in India somewhere. Anyway, the school didn't burn down for everybody at home. It would have been weird if there was like smoke on the video or something like that. I'd be like, whoa, you guys really got an inside view on that one. Everything's fine as far as I'm aware. I completely lost my train of thought. Where were we here? We're talking about what we're working on tomorrow, right? Tomorrow, we're going to be discussing some circulatory system illnesses. This is in the morning, and we're going to do the fetal pig dissection. I'm going to do it over video. I might get some people in the room to help me do some cutting. I was just talking to Ms. Rowlandson outside, and she said that she's done it in an hour as a demo. So I think it should be able to fit it in an hour tomorrow. In the afternoon, tomorrow, we're going to be working on our final project for this unit, which I haven't exactly determined what that will be yet. It will be a research project of some kind, probably related to technology. So in the curriculum book, it talks about, there's like a section that's about a technology that's used to assess the human body. So I may find something along those lines. You can pick a technology or something like that. Let me investigate this a little bit further. I don't have this idea hasn't fully crystallized yet. And in Learning Block 3, just like at the end of every unit, you guys are going to do your open book quiz. Okay? So it'll be, I'll leave it open for 2 hours. You should be able to easily complete it in 1 hour, but it's open book. So feel free to use whatever resources you'd like during Learning Block 3. I'm assuming you guys are all going to be at home. You can start it really whenever. You don't have to start it at the beginning of Learning Block 3. So you could start it whenever you get home. Just try and finish it before midnight, okay? If you're really in trouble for whatever reason, you've fallen behind, drop me an email. Okay, we can extend your deadline if necessary. But ideally, try and complete it tomorrow. That's the idea. It's during Learning Block 3, okay? And it is designed to be open book. So yeah, I put some details in there that I normally wouldn't put in a closed book test, especially with the amount of time that we've spent on some of these things, because I realize that the timeline here is extremely fast. But if you can just look in your note, it probably is not super onerous for you to go back and look at it. So I may include some details in there that I wouldn't normally include. But again, you guys have complete access to your textbook, to your notes, to Google. Use whatever resources you'd like at home to complete it, okay? So that's tomorrow. I had some people mention to me that they wanted to try writing it without their notes. Like they just wanted to like see if I don't recommend that. So I really did write the quiz in order for you to write an open book. So I wouldn't have added certain things in there if this was like a regular test. So don't feel like you need to do that. Okay, you're being really unfair to yourself if you're going to try and write that closed book. Maybe no one in here was thinking that, but a number of people have mentioned that to me about the previous one. So, okay. So going back to what we're working on today, I better give you as much time as possible now that we're a little bit behind. But so you're reading the lung capacity section. It's mentioned on page 6 of your course notes. Then there's a reading from the textbook at section 10.3. You add any new terms to your vocabulary list, which is also due tomorrow, by the way. Hopefully you have around the right requisite number of terms in there already. You should probably be getting close. And then there's a little video on the circulatory system. It's an introduction. And we're going to pick up at the beginning of block 2. If you guys have questions at home, don't be afraid to post them in the chat. And if necessary, I can open a little video conference with you. Okay, good luck. quick. Okay, so I'm hoping at this point people have watched the little video, the intro to the circulatory system. What we're going to do now is get into a little bit more detail on the structures of the circulatory system. So we're gonna be starting right here. The need for a circulatory system. This is right after the questions from the video. So you want to pull that up. I'm going to be using a little slideshow to go through this, and I posted the slideshow online as well. It is right here. Oops. Get up there? What's going on? Blank. Okay, it is working. Good. All right, so in general, circulatory systems have three components. And this applies, by the way, to pretty much all animals. Any animal that has internal circulation. So what would be the exceptions? Sea sponges don't have this because they only have one tissue, so they have no circulatory system.
Just so you know, we are back online. If you hear the fire alarm go off, we are to exit the building. Thank you.
So this would include every vertebrate. It would include insectae, annelids. Actually, I think it would be every grouping. It'd be every phylum of animals except for sea sponges. So sea sponges would be the only one that wouldn't have a true circulatory system. So all of them are going to have in some form these three things. Blood, or at least a fluid to transport gases and nutrients, waste, and hormones. Some of them are not necessarily going to have blood as we think of it because it won't have hemoglobin in it. So for insects, for example, have it's called pseudolymph, I think. And that's just like a fluid that has gases dissolved in it and nutrients. And it's not really blood per se because it's very, very bad at transporting oxygen. And insects are breathing through their skin. And it also has a very, they don't really have a true heart either, which is the third part here, a pump. They usually have something to circulate the fluid around on the inside, but it's more like a fan. It's like a little internal organ that kind of pushes the fluid in a circuit inside, but in a cavity. So it's almost like a fan fanning it around inside. It's not really a pump. So I mean, every animal has some system, but some are more pump-like than others. So ours is like a true pump. And then you got to have vessels for transport. And again, things to a greater or lesser extent are going to have vessels. Insects don't really have true vessels. They don't have an artery or a vein or something like that. They more just have like a cavity that you're pushing it around. But again, the variations on a theme. So certainly humans and all vertebrates have all these things, like a true version of all these: blood vessels, and a heart. Okay, can I keep going here? We good? Yeah. I think most of the blanks line up pretty close to this. If they don't, just give me a heads up here. I've modified this from something I got from somebody else. Okay, so what do you need this thing for? Well, circulatory system, we have been discussing, we were just talking about respiration. So obviously, O2 and CO2 transport is one of the big major reasons for a circulatory system. You gotta get O2 to your cells, and you gotta get CO2 from your cells and out of the body. So that's a major function. It is also used to get all the nutrients or food to your cells. So you're gonna absorb stuff in your digestive system, amino acids, fats, and carbohydrates, mostly glucose, and micronutrients, iron, calcium, whatever. And then you got to get that stuff to your cells, transport it to your liver, repackage it, and send it out to your cells. And that your circulatory system is going to be used for that. Your cells are making waste products, so they are producing urea, uric acid. One of its breakdown products is ammonia. And you got to transport that away from your cells, all the cell waste products, and then those are going to be filtered out by your kidneys in your blood, and then you can urinate them out. So it's used for waste disposal. It's a great mechanism for temperature and pH regulation. So you might have talked about this a little bit in grade 10 when you talked about homeostasis. I'm not sure. But if you're too hot, you might shunt some blood to the surface of your body, to the surface blood vessels. So they heat up the surface of your body, conduct the heat away, you can sweat. If you're cold, you can do the opposite, conduct it into your core. So it's a great thermal regulation system. We can maintain the pH. So we mentioned yesterday this idea that CO2 actually changes the pH of your blood. If you have more CO2 in your blood, was this yesterday or was this last week? I can't remember. Wait, it's not yesterday, Friday. Or was it Thursday? I'm not sure. Anyway, the days are blending together. The CO2 controls the pH in your blood, and so you can regulate pH by increasing or decreasing the amount of CO2 you have dissolved in your blood as carbonic acid. It has some systems in place to clot, so to help you heal wounds, which we're going to get to later. It carries white blood cells around, although it's not the only way for your white blood cells to get around. They can also travel in your lymphatic system, but you can send white blood cells in your blood to fight off infection. And they are the primary mechanism of transporting hormones and antibodies and things like that around your body. So hormones for long-term signaling, and we'll talk about that a little bit later too. Okay, so multifunctional. I would say the gas exchange part is probably the most important part. That's the part that's on a moment-to-moment basis keeping you alive, but all of these things are also necessary for you to be alive. So the basic schematic, which is really what you guys need to know for this course, is this. There is a pulmonary circuit, pulmonary means of the lung, and a systemic circuit, which is the circuit that goes around your body. Your heart pumps to both circuits. One side of the heart is dedicated to pumping one circuit, and the other side of the heart is dedicated to pumping the other circuit. And we'll go through the heart diagram later, and we'll talk about what the parts are called. But the right side of your heart, oh, I can't zoom in here, which is kind of annoying. The right side of your heart over here is dedicated just to the pulmonary circuit. So it receives blood from your body that has used up its oxygen, and then it's going to pump that blood out to the lung where it's going to get oxygenated. So we just talked about that in the respiratory system. So the blood receives its oxygen, drops off its CO2, and it's going to return now on the left side. Then the left side of the heart is responsible for pumping the blood to everywhere else. So when it does its pump, it's going to send the blood out on the systemic circuit, which goes to everything. Your brain, your arms, your legs, your liver, whatever. Your digestive tract, all the other things. Okay, so the right side of your heart is just dedicated to the pulmonary circuit, and the left side is dedicated just to the systemic circuit. Question?
Can it get all the blood that it needs to the location in like one pump? Does it need like multiple pumps?
That's a great question. Is one single pump of the heart enough to perfuse the entire circuit? Probably not. It does need to be continuously pumping, but there's not that much delay. If you are to, for example, inject a hormone or like adrenaline or something directly into the heart, I guess really what your question is asking is how many beats does it take for that signal to get everywhere? More than 1 beat. But within 5-ish seconds, you've pretty much systemically transported stuff everywhere. So it really doesn't take many beats, might just be a few beats of the heart to potentially transport everywhere. And you do have to keep this thing going. Obviously, if you stop maintaining the pressure on one side, the circulation is going to pretty much immediately stop. So you do have to keep it going. Everybody get the general idea of this here? You have 2 circuits. So that's in mammals. This is a mammalian heart. It's a 4-chambered heart. We'll talk about how this splits up into 4 here. Good question. So heart murmurs can be caused by different things. It's extra, really all it means is that there's an extra sound in the heart. But, so you could potentially, okay, let's draw a heart here. Got your 2 atria and then you got your ventricles at the bottom. So you could potentially have a hole in between the 2 ventricles that's causing your murmur. So that'll give you a little extra sound. Before you're born, as a developing baby in the womb, you are not breathing, right? You don't. So you actually pump very little blood to your lungs when you're unborn, just due to the fact that you don't need to perfuse them with blood that much. You're not doing gas exchange. So there's actually a valve in between the 2 ventricles that allows blood to skip the pulmonary loop. It actually doesn't go around the pulmonary loop. And when you're born, that closes pretty much immediately. And then you build a really thick septum over top of that previous valve that you had in between the 2 ventricles, ideally. So some people don't have a full closing of the valve, and then it can cause a little bit of leakage between the 2, and that causes a heart murmur. So that can happen, and then you get oxygenated and deoxygenated blood mixing together between the ventricles, and it makes your heart less efficient. So you don't want that. And oftentimes, if the hole is bigger than just a little teeny tiny hole, it needs to be repaired. But you can also get a heart murmur. There are valves in between. So, for example, here's your atrium on one side, and then the ventricles at the bottom. So there's a valve that goes in between the 2, and when you pump the ventricle at the bottom, you don't want the blood to go backwards, back up through the atrium again. So there's a valve that is supposed to shut to prevent backflow. Tomorrow, by the way, when I do the fetal pig dissection, I'm gonna see if I can find an old heart too. I think we got some hearts preserved, and they're pretty big, so that you can see these components of the heart a little bit better as well. I'll see if I can find one anyway. But anyway, if any blood leaks backwards through the valve, that makes an extra sound during the heart beating as well, and that also can cause a heart murmur. So I think those are the 2 main sounds. Those are the 2 main types of murmurs that you can get. There's probably other ways to get heart murmurs as well, but it's usually leaky valve or leaky septum. But again, I'm not a doctor, so this isn't meant to be a diagnostic, but I'm pretty sure those are the 2 main types of heart issue that you can have that cause murmuring. Oh, I colored right on top of this. Okay, so like I said, the right side here is for the pulmonary circuit, which is dealing with deoxygenated blood, right? It's pumping the blood that doesn't have oxygen in it to the lungs. And then the left side is dealing mostly with oxygenated blood. So it's taking that oxygenated blood from the lungs and sending it out to the body. Okay, let's take a look at some of the components of the blood. So I'm going to go in detail here and talk about what's actually in your blood. When you give a blood sample, what's in that thing? 4 major components in your blood. The first one is plasma. Now, I can't remember what this looks like on the sheet, but is this the area where it's asking what is in plasma, or is this just asking you for what the 4 parts are? Just the 4 parts. Okay, so I'll go into detail with these in a second then. We'll do it here. So plasma, white blood cells, which are mostly leukocytes. Those are your immune cells. Platelets, which are little nets for fixing leaks. And your red blood cells, otherwise known as erythrocytes. As a heads up, I mostly refer to the white blood cells as leukocytes and the red blood cells as erythrocytes. That is their name. So, if you're reading in scientific article and anything has the prefix erythro in it, it's always relating to red blood cells. And if it has the prefix leuco, it's always referring to white blood cells. Like leukemia, for example. Leukemia is a cancer of your red blood cells, or white blood cells, rather. White blood cells. Okay, so let's say that you took a blood sample, okay? And you probably had this done at some point, I would assume. Maybe not. But you can take that blood sample, put it in a centrifuge, spin it up. We used to do this lab in grade 11. We're not allowed to use human fluids anymore. This is right when I started teaching. We used to do this, but no human fluids allowed in the lab at school, so we don't do blood sampling. But you spin the blood sample down, and it will separate. So at the bottom, which is the heaviest component, or in the centrifuge, the bottom would be the outside of the centrifuge. That's where your red blood cells are going to congregate. So you can check to see what percentage by volume of your blood is red blood cells. And average for humans is somewhere around 44% of the volume. So around 44%, a little bit less than half, is red blood cells. If you are an elite athlete, like a cyclist or something like that, you might have 50 or 60% red blood cells. So you might have by volume way more red blood cells. That's one of the adaptations you get when you train aerobically, is that you just get more red blood cells for transporting more oxygen. But typically for like the average person, somewhere around 45%. Then in between that and the plasma, which is really the water component, there's what's called the buffy coat. So the buffy coat in the middle is white blood cells and platelets. The platelets are actually so few that you can't really see the platelets. It's mostly white blood cells in there. And then the rest is plasma, which is mostly water. So that's the general breakdown. When we're talking about what's in the water component, what's in the plasma, it's, like I said, it makes up about 55% of your blood volume. It's almost completely water. So it's about 92% water. Is this on your sheet? Does it ask you about this? I can't remember if it's on there. I think it is. It has a little bit of protein in there. So this is where the water-soluble protein, the amino acids, hormones, all that kind of stuff, that'd be protein, makes up about 7% of that liquid. It's proteins dissolved in water. And then you're going to get other dissolved solids in there. So, for example, the cell waste products, uric acid, urea, electrolytes, a little bit of gas is dissolved in there. A little bit of oxygen gets dissolved. A little bit of carbon dioxide gets dissolved in the liquid. So that's the 1% water component. Red blood cells look like this. They look like little inner tubes. We're going to talk about the internal structure in a second. They're very tiny. You guys saw them in the video running through the blood vessels? They look like little inner tubes on like a little lazy river getting pumped through. And then the white blood cells, which are also in the buffy coat there with the platelets. There are several different kinds. This all depends on the function of the white blood cell. So is it making antibodies? Is it eating bacteria or virus particles? That would be a phagocyte. Is it the type of white blood cell that is just there to remember the intruder? So those are called helper T cells. Some of them are there to just send a signal to other white blood cells to show up. So that's another type of T cell. So there are a bunch of different types of white blood cells, and they have different functions in the immune system. So I thought about posting a video about it, but there's like 25 different kinds, and it's very confusing. So you don't need to know for this course. But in general, the white blood cells are doing the immune function. So they're either killing things or they're remembering which things to kill. Basic. Okay, we mentioned this stuff already, didn't we? Did I get this? Did you guys get all this stuff? About the plasma? Okay, red blood cells. The inner tubes. Assuming you don't have sickle cell anemia, this is the standard shape for red blood cells. They have this interesting inner tube shape. Very functional. Anyone want to take a good guess why, from an evolutionary perspective, this is a really good shape for a red blood cell? What do you think? What do you think? Yeah, exactly. And this is a good shape if you want to squeeze something through a tube. This is a good shape to squeeze through a tube. You're pumping these at high pressure through tiny little vessels, right? You guys saw the video of it. So if there's like any sharp edges or anything on the outside of them, it's gonna tear up your blood vessels. That's actually what happens when people have sickle cell anemia, is these cells don't come with the right shape. They're a little bit pointy and they get stuck in your small vessels and they cause like inappropriate clotting and pain and things like that. So you want them to be this like round, squishy shape, so you can just kind of poke them into all the little blood vessels and stuff, and they flow really well. They have these nice smooth rounded edges so that they can just kind of bounce around through all the blood vessels. You don't want to damage the inside of your vessels. You make these in your bone marrow. They don't have a nucleus, so they're enucleated. They're one of the very few cells in your body that doesn't have a nucleus, so they don't have any way to build new proteins because they can't do the thing that we talked about previously, the transcription and translation, right? They can't read the DNA and make new proteins. So they get a set of proteins when they are created, and then they just use those until they can no longer use them and they start to break down. And then your body removes them through your spleen. So your spleen is responsible for removing old red blood cells from your blood. So that shape is called a biconcave disc, by the way. It's a disc and it's concave on both sides. So the primary function of these guys is gas transport. They bind very strongly to O2, so they're great at transporting O2 because of hemoglobin, which we'll talk about in 2 seconds. And they also have a weaker affinity for CO2, so they can transport CO2 as well. The CO2 will dissolve into your blood, and then the red blood cells will grab it out of the blood because they have a fairly high affinity for CO2. So hemoglobin is a protein complex that is found at the center of every red blood cell. So red blood cells build this in the process of creation of the cell. Obviously, they can't build this once they are a red blood cell. They don't have a nucleus. But this is in the process of building the red blood cell when it still has a nucleus. It creates this hemoglobin complex in the center. Those little green things right there are heme groups that contain iron. They have iron at the center, an actual iron atom. And this is the reason why you need dietary iron. So dietary iron is really not used for anything. I'm thinking if there's any other biochemical pathway that uses iron. I don't think so. This is the only one that I know of. And it's used because iron really is sticky for oxygen. It has a very high affinity to bonding with oxygen. That's why things rust. That's why iron rusts. It has a high affinity for oxygen. So because of its high affinity for oxygen, you just pop a couple of those in the center of your protein complex, and then oxygen sticks to it. Really useful. So you can use this to transport oxygen in your blood, and the more red blood cells you have, the better you are at transporting oxygen, which is why when you train, one of the adaptations is that you get more red blood cells. It does change color slightly, so it's like a purpley color, like a reddy purple. And then when it does bind to oxygen, it becomes like a bright red color. So that's the difference between oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. I should mention that there is no blue blood. So even when it's deoxygenated, it doesn't look blue, but it does look kind of purpley. Actually, let me see if I can find a good picture of it. I think because people always assume that the blood in their veins is blue, but it's really not blue. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Perfect. There's the difference right there. So the one on the right-hand side there is deoxygenated blood. It's kind of like a purpley dark red. And then the one on the left-hand side there is oxygenated blood. So there is a color difference between the two, but it's not like, it doesn't turn blue. If you look at your veins, people are saying, oh, why are my veins blue then? So the veins do look blue, but this has more to do with additive color theory than it does with the fact that they are actually blue. It's because of the vein with the reddish blood in it, plus all of the layers of skin and fascia on top. When you look at all of the different colors of light that they combined absorb, the color that they reflect then, what's left over to be reflected is blue. But they're not actually blue themselves. So if you were to like take these out and look just at the vein, it actually looks more like that color and a lot less blue. All right, and then the white blood cells, the leukocytes, these are for protecting you against disease. They look for flags. We talked about this previously. Those antigens that are shapes that don't belong in your body, and they attack things based on their shape. And they're really cool. They are autonomous, so they will travel through your circulatory system and your lymphatic system and go wherever they wish. So they are carried by the flow of your circulatory system, but if they are receiving a chemical messenger through your blood vessel walls from a specific area in your body, they will get off the bus. So they will exit out of your circulatory system at whatever area they are receiving that signal from, and they will go and find the location where the signal is being given out, telling them to arrive. So you actually get a congregation of white blood cells at whatever area of your body is experiencing infection. They go there physically, which is kind of cool. They're autonomous and they kind of just make their way there. So they follow the flow of the blood, but then they can also get off the bus at any time and move to a specific area of the body, which is kind of cool. Yeah, they make a bunch of enzymes to break stuff down. Some of them, T cells, produce antibodies which help inactivate bacteria and viruses and help identify them for other leukocytes to eat. Can I keep going? Just cognizant of people typing. I don't want to step on anyone's feet. Okay, and then lastly, we have the platelets. They're not really cells. They're made out of cells. They also don't have a nucleus. They aren't really true cells. Like I said, they're kind of like cell pieces. And they're only around for about 10 days before they get cycled again through the spleen. But the basics of this is that they're kind of like little nets. They aggregate around the site of a wound. So they respond to hormone signaling from broken cells. So when cells get broken, they release a bunch of chemicals into the bloodstream. They're called cytokines. And those proteins or the signal that they're giving off is saying, basically, there's damage here. It's a damage signaling. And the platelets will aggregate. They'll stick to the areas where those proteins are being released. And then the platelets that stick to those areas release another hormone called thrombin. So what thrombin does is it takes fibrin. Fibrin is floating around in your blood. They're basically like little pieces of a net, is what they are. They're like net pieces. When they float around in your blood, they're in a form called fibrinogen. So fibrinogen doesn't stick to anything. It's not sticky. It just floats around in your blood. But when fibrinogen touches thrombin, they combine together and they make fibrin. Fibrin is sticky. So that fibrin will actually stick to the area where blood is escaping. And this process is very fast. If you've ever cut yourself shaving or had a paper cut or something like that, it bleeds pretty much right away. Not a lot, especially in the case of a paper cut or something like that, because you're only cutting maybe a few tiny little blood vessels in that case, maybe 10 or 15 little blood vessels in that area that you've punctured. And very quickly, you're going to get platelets aggregating, releasing thrombin, and then the thrombin is going to cause the fibrin to become fibrinogen, or fibrinogen to become fibrin rather, which will stick really quickly to the hole. And as it makes that net of little pieces over top of the hole, it makes a web that prevents red blood cells from exiting. So it creates this really fine little mesh over top of the hole. This works really well for small holes. So if you've got a small hole in your circulatory system, usually the body's pretty good at that. You can put a little patch on there using fibrin, and then the cells will do their repair mechanisms. They'll do mitosis and stuff, fill in the gaps. The linings of your blood vessels will regrow and fill in the gap. And this stuff's happening all the time. Even when you just like bump your hand off of a table or something like that, you do minor damage to your blood vessels. They're actually surprisingly fragile. But that kind of repair stuff is going on all the time. Just little things all the time. If you have no clotting mechanism like this, some people basically have none, it hardly works at all, they'll get bruises just from everyday life tasks, just like, bumping your hand hard on your desk or something like that, like they'll get bruises. So like you can injure the blood vessels fairly easily, but you're constantly doing repair work to keep everything functioning properly. If you've got a big hole, that's a little bit more difficult. So keep in mind that these are like the size of proteins here, right, that are trying to create this mesh. So if you're trying to throw that mesh over like a 2-centimeter hole, you're gonna have a hard time. So if you've got a really big hole, or the hole is in an artery where the pressure is extremely high, you got to help it out a little bit, which is, if anyone's taken first aid before, anybody taken first aid? What do you do for a big bleed?
You have to apply pressure to the wound.
You got to apply pressure. What does the pressure do? What do you think the pressure does?
I should know this. Oh, this is my job. It like helps give an extra layer to the mesh.
Sure. Basically, you're doing that. You're also reducing the blood flow to that area. So when you push on it, you're actually preventing blood from flowing to that spot. And so then you don't have blood coming through and busting a hole in the mesh that's forming. So you got to give it a couple minutes at least, usually, depending on the size of the hole, for things to really mesh over well so that you can let go of it and it doesn't start leaking out again. So if the hole is huge, obviously, or if it's an arterial hole, it may actually require a surgical repair to close it, or there probably is no way to close it. But and then do you guys use tourniquets then if there's an arterial injury, right? So you may have to completely block the blood flow so that it can be surgically repaired later with a tourniquet. So here's an example. This is an actual fibrin net. That's called a network. And this is a picture taken with an electron microscope, so you can see what it looks like. And then there are some red blood cells that are trapped in there. And a little bit difficult to see, but there are platelets that are caught in this net as well. They're like the white spots. So this is actually a platelet right here. This is a platelet here. This is a platelet here. So those are the cells that are sending out that hormone signal to make that fibrinogen sticky. Let's stick over top of the patch. Okay. This is somebody's blood vessels. Anybody ever go to Body Worlds before? Well, it's really cool if you get a chance. This is by the way, this is a real person. They make all the things in Body Worlds by taking people, corpses, and then they use like a plasticization technique. They plasticize their blood vessels or tissues, and they make models out of them. So they're made out of real people. So it's kind of cool. I think that people donate their body for this, which is kind of a weird thing. But this one's cool because what they do to make these blood vessel ones is they use a plasticizer that they put into the bloodstream that basically turns the insides of the blood vessels into rubber, and then they use an acid to dissolve all of the tissue around it. So it only leaves the blood vessels behind, and all the other tissue gets dissolved. So that's what this is. This is somebody's facial blood vessels, which is kind of cool. Interesting to note here, by the way, that some areas have more blood supply than others. So we talked about the fact that there's usually no more than 4 cells away from a capillary, from a blood vessel. I think I mentioned that before. Well, there are some areas in the body where there's more blood vessels than that, where the cells are like 1 or only 2 cells away from a blood vessel. The face is a perfect example. So the face, for some reason, is like one of the most highly vascularized areas of your body. It has a ton of vascularization in your face. If you've ever blushed before, you've experienced the vascularization in your face. If you've ever seen somebody be cut in a fight before, like if you ever watch UFC or something, you see somebody get cut in the face, those cuts always bleed like crazy because there's so many blood vessels in the face. which is interesting. Okay, let's keep going here. So that's the basics. That takes us down to here, right? The heart? Okay. So we've already mentioned previously that this thing is a pump. The purpose of a pump is to move a fluid. That's what it does. So it moves a fluid, in this case through a complex network of vessels, and it never gets to take a break. At rest, probably something like 70 beats per minute. You could measure it for yourself if you wanted to. Mine's going a little bit faster than that now. Yeah, mine's probably 85 or something right now. I'm excited. I'm excited about biology. But that's somewhere around 100,000 beats per day. 70 beats per minute all day, 100,000 beats per day. Pretty big number when you think about it. And it's got to do that every day of your life. It never gets to take a break. Until you're dead. So when you're exercising, it could go as high as 250, 280. For most people, their max heart rate is 220 minus your age, approximately. So for you guys, it'd be somewhere around 205-ish. But that's just an average. So for some people, it can actually be quite a lot higher than that. Try measuring it one time. Do you guys do this in phys ed? You ever measure your heart rate? Yeah, so you might use that as part of like a fitness measurement that you do. And I promise this is just coincidence, but the actual length of the vessels, if you were to take every capillary and lay everything end to end, it's about 100,000 kilometers of vessels in your body, which is a lot. There's a lot of vessels. If you think about how small your cells are, and you have to have a capillary running, every 4 cells, basically, yeah, that's going to be a lot of vessels. So it's quite a system. And you have to pump blood through all of them all the time. What a cool system. You want to go for a run, you want to walk up the stairs, you got to increase the amount of blood you're pumping to all 100,000 kilometers of vessels. Now, some more than others. You can redirect blood flow to certain areas. You can relax blood vessels in certain areas so more flow goes there. You can constrict blood vessels in other areas so that less blood flow goes there. So you can coordinate that. So it does have some mechanisms for increasing or decreasing the pressure. And it is simultaneously pumping 2 different circuits. So you've got your pulmonary circuit to the lungs, where it's going to collect O2 and drop off CO2. And then you got your second systemic circuit to the body cells, where it's going to distribute that O2 and collect CO2. So let's talk about the actual anatomy of this thing. I'm hoping tomorrow I will have a fresh heart in there. I should have looked in the cabinet. I think we might be out of hearts, but I'll investigate. So I think what I'm going to do here is I'm going to follow blood as it goes through the heart from the starting with the blood that is returning to the heart from the body. Okay. So after your cells have used up all the oxygen and now the blood is filled with carbon dioxide from your body, you're going to get blood returning. And I am going to use, maybe I should use purple, actually. I was going to use blue, but blue is probably a bad idea. So I don't want people to think that the blood is blue. It's not blue. Right? Is that a good? Yeah, that's pretty good. Okay, so we've got blood coming in here and blood coming in here. So this would be blood from the lower half of the body. Or say from the lower body. And then we got blood coming back from the upper body. Upper body would be your arms and your head. And a little bit of your chest cavity, although just your upper chest. Most of the chest is actually coming in through the bottom one. So we've got that blood returning to the heart, and it spills into this little cavity right here. Oh, I should mention what these vessels are called. So this big blue vessel on the top here is called the superior vena cava. Oop, not vein. So much Latin. So much Latin in this stuff. Superior just means upper when you're talking about anatomical terms. Vena means vein. And cava just means cavernous, big. Okay? So this is the upper big vein. All right? And then you got your lower big vein. So the lower big vein is on the bottom. The word for lower in anatomical terms is inferior. So this is the inferior vena cava, the lower big vein. If you ever decide to go into medicine, Latin course recommended. Lots of Latin. I wonder if my partner ever took Latin. I should ask her, or my brother. I'm not sure. So they both pump into this first chamber of the heart. I'm going to call it the first. I guess it depends on where you want to start the process. But the first on return from the body anyway. So this cavity at the top where the blood is returning is called the right atrium. If we do get a chance to actually look at the atrium in detail, one of the really interesting things that you'll notice about it is that it's really not very thick. It's very flimsy. It sits on top of the heart, and the reason it's not very thick is it doesn't really have to do that much. All that it does when it contracts is it pushes blood down into the ventricle. So its job is to fill this chamber down here to the top, basically. So its job is to help fill the ventricle. If you have atrial fibrillation, that is your muscle, your atrium muscle is kind of twitchy and it doesn't really do a good job pumping, it's not always fatal necessarily. It's not great because it can increase your chance of getting a blood clot, but you don't necessarily like stop living if your atriums don't function properly. So they're there to help fill the ventricles. It's not great if they're not functioning properly. It makes your heart a lot less efficient. But whereas the ventricles at the bottom, the big boys or girls, if these guys stop working, that's kaput. So you need these ones. These are the ones that are going to do the pulmonary or the systemic circuit for you. So and they're much thicker. So okay, you got your right atrium. It's pumping into the right ventricle. Is there actually a where's the, oh, I think I put this in the wrong spot. Let me move this over. I think the label's supposed to go right here. Okay, so that's the right ventricle down there. That's this whole chamber right here. So when that chamber at the bottom contracts, that's going to pump blood on the pulmonary circuit, the lung circuit. So it pumps that blood up through this valve and then up through these arteries right here. These arteries are called the pulmonary arteries. We're going to get into detail on blood vessels later, but arteries are always carrying blood away from the heart. So if blood is leaving the heart, it's in an artery. This one is a little bit weird because it's the only artery in your body that carries deoxygenated blood. All the other arteries carry oxygenated blood, which is a little bit confusing. It's purple on this diagram, which a lot of people find confusing, and they label it as the pulmonary vein. But veins are always returning blood to the heart. So if it's ever leaving the heart, it's going in an artery. This is pulmonary artery. Pulmonary just means of the lung. So we should probably name these valves as well. So I'm gonna simplify this a little bit. You don't need to know the names of the left and right ones specifically. They do have different names. But this valve right here, this valve that prevents backflow into the atrium, this is the right AV valve or atrioventricular valve. Atrioventricular, there we go. So it's between the atrium and the ventricle, so it's an atrioventricular valve. When the heart pumps, and that ventricle is pretty beefy, you can actually see, look at all this muscle here. It's beefy. So when this thing contracts, there's quite a bit of pressure going to the lungs. And this valve, it's just a little teeny tiny piece of tissue here. It's got to be pretty strong, this valve, so that blood doesn't end up getting pumped backwards into your veins. So in order to keep the valve from going backwards and not breaking, you need some heartstrings. These are your heartstrings right here. So when someone is tugging on your heartstrings, they're pulling on these little strings. These little strings have a scientific name too. They're called chordae tendineae. Nope. Chordae. There we go. Tendineae. Oh, you don't think that's spelled right, do you? I'm pretty sure it is. Stop doing that. There we go. Chordae tendineae. Those are your heartstrings. If we do end up getting to do this dissection, I'm hoping I'm going to give at least some people an opportunity to tug on the heartstrings because they are impressively strong. You can take them in your hand and basically pull as hard as you can, and you can't break these things. It's crazy. They're so strong. If you think about it, they have to be really strong because they're holding that heart valve for your entire life and preventing it from prolapsing. So they have to be pretty strong. So, and they're under quite a bit of pressure. Same thing on the left side here. You got the same system going on. So anyway, you're going to pump now. There is another valve here. So this valve, the second valve, which is located right here, this valve, every time you pump with the ventricle, the blood is going to go up into the lungs, and you don't want it to go backwards into the heart again once the heart relaxes. So this valve right here is actually preventing blood from flowing back into the heart again. And so this one, oh boy, I better not mix these up. This is the bicuspid. Let me double check that. It's called a semilunar valve. That's like the name of the type of valve. Let me just double check. Bicuspid or tricuspid? Which one is which? tricuspid. Yeah, the bicuspid's on the other side. So this one is called the tricuspid. If you've ever heard of somebody having a valve replacement, that'll be a tricuspid valve. Or, I mean, they could have the other valve replaced, do the AV valve, but tricuspid and bicuspid are common valve replacements that people have. So the reason it's called a tricuspid is if you actually look at it from the top, it has 3 cuspids, 3 parts like this. Like that. And so the blood, when it's open, the blood actually flows like in the middle there, but then it's 3 flaps that close. So that's a tricuspid. On the other side, the valve only has 2 flaps. I may as well name it right now. So this is the one on the other side right here. And that one is after the left ventricle, and that's called the bicuspid. And it's called that because I'll use the same coloring scheme here, pink. Because it only has 2 flaps like this. And the blood would be that's what flows in the middle there, between the 2 flaps. Okay, so we've pumped the blood away, out through the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. It goes through all those tiny little capillaries in the lungs, past the alveoli, gets lots of oxygen, drops off its CO2, and now it's got to get back to the heart again to go on the other circuit. So the blood is going to return. I'm going to use red now for the blood because the blood is oxygenated now. So it's going to come back in through these 2 vessels. One is from the right lung and one is from the left lung. And these 2 vessels here are called the pulmonary arteries. Pulmonary veins. Because blood is going back to the heart. This is pulmonary vein. Or veins, there's 2 of them. There's 2 leaving as well. I don't know if you guys noticed this. It splits into 2. So one of the arteries goes to the left lung and one of them goes to the right. So here the blood is coming back from the lungs through the pulmonary vein and into this skimpy little valve or chamber over here at the top of the heart. This little chamber, again, its only job is just to fill up the ventricle. And that is the left atrium. One thing that's really important to note here is that what we're looking at this diagram of the heart, right? And I'm labeling all the stuff over here as right this, right this, right this, but it's on the left side of the diagram, right? That's confusing. It's because you have to imagine that you are looking at a person, okay? You are facing a person, and this is their right atrium, their right AV valve, whatever, okay? So they're facing you. So what's on your left-hand side is their right, which is why it's called the right, okay? I don't know why, but that one thing really tends to mess people up, is that it says it's right, but it's on the left-hand side of the diagram. It's because they're facing you, okay? So this is for a person that's facing you. Okay, so the left atrium contracts. It's gonna pump blood down here into the left ventricle. I won't label the heartstrings again. They're exactly the same on this side. Left ventricle. What I will mention, and I forgot to label before, was that you have this big beefy piece of muscle tissue in the center here. This is the heart's septum. That's the part that potentially you could have a hole in when you're born. So you may have a hole in your septum because it doesn't seal properly when you're born, and you start using your pulmonary circuit. When that baby takes its first breath, you start using your pulmonary circuit. Really crazy to think that those lungs, when they're in there inside a baby, maybe I think about this more because I'm about to have a baby, but it's not being used. It's so crazy. Like, so its lungs have never opened. There's never been gas inside them before. There's not really blood getting pumped through them. And then all of a sudden when it's born, It's just like, all right, it's go time. You like start pumping blood to the lungs, and then gas goes in for like the very first time into the lungs. Like, I think that's so crazy. They're not practicing, because they practice all kinds of other stuff in the womb, right? They're like moving around and like peeing and stuff. They're like doing all kinds of stuff in there, right? But they're not breathing, which is really crazy. They've never done it. They just come out and they're like, oh, let's do it. I think that's crazy. Okay, anyway. The left ventricle contracts. Also, one thing, interesting thing to note, if you look at the size, the amount of tissue here, you'll notice that the left ventricle is a lot thicker than the right ventricle, okay? And that's because when you pump this one, you have to pump blood just to the lungs. The lungs are right beside, okay? There's a lot of blood vessels in the lungs, but they're basically right beside. But when you pump for the left ventricle, you gotta pump everywhere in your entire body. You gotta get blood up to the top of your head, to the furthest reaches of your toes. You gotta send blood everywhere from the left. So the actual pump, the pressure on this pump is a lot higher. It's a much higher pressure on this side. Yes?
Could you have like too much pressure?
Oh, absolutely. Chronic high blood pressure. When we talk tomorrow about illnesses of the circulatory system, that's one of the things we'll talk about. Chronic high blood pressure. But yes, you can. If your blood pressure is elevated for an extended length of time, it does damage your blood vessels. So that is problematic. You can also have weaknesses in these arteries. For example, like in this big artery up here. So when the blood comes out of here, it gets pumped up through this valve, which is the bicuspid, and then it goes around this circuit right here. And you can see some of the blood will go up here to the right arm, head, left arm. Okay, it gets subdivided. And then some of it's going to loop around and then go to the lower half of the body. So usually they actually show it here, but the vessel continues down here underneath. It loops around. So this big branch up here, this big blood vessel is the largest one in your body, and this is your aorta. Not aorta. Come on, help me out here. Aorta. I'm struggling. There we go. So you can get defects in your aorta. It's under high pressure, 3 to 4 psi, kind of like the same pressure that you'd see in like a properly pumped up football or a soccer ball. So if you rupture this thing, like blood launches out of it, right? Like it's under extremely high pressure. So if you ever damage your aorta, you can exsanguinate, you can lose all of your blood in 15 seconds. It doesn't take long, you know, a couple pumps and you've already lost like 3, 4, or 5 liters of blood. So it's really important not to rupture this one. The ones that are under very high pressure, you're gonna get yourself into big trouble if you get holes in those. So anyway, even if you're in the hospital when that happens, like very difficult to get to that kind of stuff in time. You don't have very long. All right, so those are the basic parts. There's quite a few there. Under normal circumstances, I would say you need to know all of these parts, but realistically the quiz is gonna be open book anyway, so you can use this as a reference. But normally you do need to know these for this course, just so you know. I'm not really sure how we're gonna address that stuff, but any questions about what these parts are doing and like about any of them in particular? No? All right, cool. So that's the heart, that's the pump. Let's talk about the blood vessels. How much more do I have here? Hopefully not too much. Blood vessels, that's it. This is the last part, guys. Okay. I think there's some reading that goes along with this too. Oh, this used to be an assignment. This is actually not an assignment anymore, by the way. We used to do an assignment for this, but we don't have time for that, so I forgot to delete the word assignment. I removed all the instructions, but I didn't remove the word assignment. This is not an assignment. Okay, 3 main types of blood vessels. In general, you should know the properties of these 3 types of vessels. So, the big ones, the biggest ones, are arteries. They are the blood vessels that are going away from the heart. They have an inner layer of epithelial tissue. You guys talked about this in grade 10, right? The types of tissues? Yeah. So epithelial tissue always forms the surface layer, right? So they have an epithelial lining on the inside, and that epithelial lining is very flexible and responsive to hormone signaling. So right underneath that is a whole heck of a lot of muscle. So arteries are very muscle thick. Right under the epithelial layer, there's a big band of muscle. And the reason for that is you can constrict your arteries and make them really small, or you can relax your arteries and make them really big. That's called vasoconstriction and vasodilation. And that's so you can direct blood flow to wherever your body wants to direct blood flow. If you've ever been crouching, or maybe even just like been in a hot tub, and then suddenly stood up, anybody ever done that before? What happens? What happens when you're like crouching for a really long time, you suddenly stand up? Maybe this doesn't happen to young people. I mean, I haven't been young for a long time. What's that?
Can't see.
You can't see, right? Get dizzy, see stars, or whatever. Okay, that's called going vasovagal. When you go vasovagal, what that means is that you have all these relaxed arteries from sitting down, crouching over, whatever. Same thing happens in a hot tub because the heat actually relaxes them and causes them to open up. And then when you stand up, you need to increase your blood pressure in order to get blood up to your brain, right? But because your blood vessels are so relaxed, there isn't enough pressure in your vessels to actually pump it up to your brain at that point. So you're depriving your brain of oxygen and blood flow for a little bit. That's why you're going all vasovagal. Very quickly, usually, especially if you're young, your blood vessels recover and they start constricting right away, which increases the pressure to your brain. And then you are no longer vasovagal. Hopefully you didn't pass out or fall over. So that is all based purely on being able to constrict or relax your blood vessels. And obviously it makes a big difference. If your blood vessels can't do that properly, yeah, you can't regulate that. Okay, you stand up quickly and you will just become unconscious and fall over. All right, so that smooth muscle around your arteries is actually very important for regulating blood flow around your body, especially for your brain, but for all other reasons as well. When we talk about illnesses tomorrow, you'll see how important this is. There's lots of different illnesses where you can't properly regulate blood flow using the constriction of your arteries. So this is for vasoconstriction and vasodilation. And then lastly, you have some pretty strong connective tissue around the outside. And really the purpose of the connective tissue is just to hold in all the pressure. So it's just like a very strong, like a rubber hose basically, just so that you don't spring a leak. So there's pretty strong connective tissue around the outside of the artery just to prevent leaks. Now all of this together, there is a method that your arteries have to keep blood flowing in the same direction. Why do you think blood always continuously only flows one way and doesn't go backwards? What's the reason? What's the reason that water in your hose only flows one way and never goes backwards? Pressure, right? They're under pressure. So these vessels are always under pressure from your heart. There's always some pressure in your arteries, and that keeps the blood always flowing in one direction. So that's not true for all of your blood vessels, as you'll see in a second. But on the artery side, as long as you've got pressure, everything's going to flow the right way. You can't have stuff flowing backwards or the whole system breaks down. So forwards is essential. Blood is always going in one direction. Okay, so that's on the arterial side. And arteries, by the way, can break up into slightly smaller vessels called arterioles, and the arterioles can break into smaller arterioles. But as long as they have all of these properties, that is smooth muscle with the connective tissue on the outside, that's an artery, okay, or an arteriole. They all have the same basic like structure. Eventually, you're going to get arterioles splitting and splitting and splitting and splitting and splitting until you get teeny tiny vessels that are only one cell thick, okay? Those are the vessels that actually perfuse your organs and go through all of like your skin and like all the stuff, okay? So that network in the middle are a type of blood vessel called a capillary or a capillary, depending on who you ask, okay? So capillaries have a couple important properties. Make this a little bit smaller here. They're one cell thick. And if you actually look at the pressure in the capillaries, it's very low. And the reason it's, whoa, what just happened there? Very low pressure. The reason it's so low is if you think about like a big river. If you break a big river up into like 300 tiny little streams, the pressure in any individual stream is going to be much lower, right? They're going to be these like tiny little streams. So once you get down to the capillary level, there's really not a lot of pressure in there. If it's 3 psi up at the arterial or up at the artery level, by the time you get down to the capillary, it's like 0.00001 psi, okay? A much, much reduced pressure. Just enough to keep everything moving, but really it's insignificant. If you've ever cut your skin and seen how slowly the blood comes out, it comes out pretty slow. Sometimes it actually takes a couple seconds to even see any blood when you cut yourself. And that's because the pressure in them is fairly low. There's not really a lot of stuff pushing it out. On the other side, once those little vessels start coming together again into a bigger vessel, and then those two big ones will come into another bigger one, and then they'll flow into another bigger one. So those bigger ones and bigger ones and bigger ones are called venules. And then eventually, when you get several larger venules coming together, you get a vein. So veins are on the other side of the system. They're collecting the blood to bring the blood back to the heart, okay? That's the collection system on the other side. One more thing I want to add for these to these arteries is that these are found deep. So if you want to find an artery in your arm, for example, it's pretty much in the middle of your arm. Okay, it's right next to the bone, it's deep. And from an evolutionary perspective, what's the best place to keep your high pressure vessels? Away from the surface, okay? You don't want them to get cut easily, right? If we evolve to have our high pressure vessels on the outside, it's gonna be problematic, okay? Minor cuts and things are gonna break some of your high pressure vessels. You're gonna have blood flying at 3 psi all over the room. So you want to keep these vessels safe and deep. Whereas on the other side, the veins, here, these ones these are all shallow. So pretty much if you can see a blood vessel from the surface, that's not how you spell shallow. Oh, it's gonna autocorrect. If you can see a vein from the surface, or a blood vessel from the surface, it's all veins. 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 Everything you can see on the surface is a vein, pretty much. I didn't put a cross section of a vein on here. Darn. I guess this is pretty close. This is pretty close. So if you look at, actually, yeah, whoops, this is fine. If you look at the cross section here of a vein, one thing that you notice is there is muscle, but it's compared to the artery, it's a lot less. Because veins don't really have the ability to constrict very much. They're pretty floppy. So, and they don't really have the ability to change their diameter too much. A little bit. They can change their diameter a bit, but not a lot. And they're not under high pressure. So once all the capillaries come back together again, one thing that you notice is that it's low pressure flowing through them. It's not on the same side as the pump. So it's got a low pressure. So you have to have a strategy then, if it's low pressure, to keep the blood going in one direction. Anyone know what the strategy is? This is, by the way, the same strategy that your heart uses to keep blood going in the same direction. Guesses? Valves, okay? Good guess. It has a system of valves. So these valves They run all the way through your whole venous system. And every time the blood gets pushed a little bit towards your heart, the blood can fall backwards a little bit onto a valve, and then it won't completely fall back to the beginning of the vein again, okay? So it's, when blood is moving in the vein, it's more incremental movement. It's like a little bit up and on a valve, a little bit up and on a valve, a little bit up and on a valve, because it doesn't have that really strong continuous flow forcing it back to your heart, because that's on the other side of the system. So it has a system of valves to keep blood moving in the correct direction. Why is this going so short? Nope, not cell. System of valves. Oh, I hate making a typo like that. There we go. Thanks, autocorrect. And then we get back to the heart again, process, repeat. Okay? So this same setup is found pretty much everywhere blood travels. You've got an artery flowing to every muscle. You've got an artery flowing to every organ. You have two big arteries flowing to your brain, left and right side, your two carotid arteries. So everything is going to have arterial flow going to it deep, and is going to have venous return coming shallow back to the heart again. Questions about this system of blood vessels? The three main kinds, artery, capillary, and vein? No? Okay. I have some questions for you guys to do. They're right here. Give these a shot. Take the rest of the class. And tomorrow, we're going to talk a little bit about how to diagnose problems of the heart. We're going to talk about what makes your heart beat. And we're going to talk about how to read an ECG. If you've ever had one of these in the hospital before. Boop, look at the electrical activity of your heart. And then we're going to cut open a pig. Hooray! Cool. Okay, I'll give you guys at home here a chance to work on this. If you have any questions, don't be afraid to post them. And if you're running into new vocabulary, guys, don't forget to add it to your vocabulary list. It just makes it easier at the end, so you don't have to go back and add stuff. All right.